Which is it? One will make you a living hypocrite acceptable to Satan. The other will make you a living sacrifice acceptable to God. So Paul calls us to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. He goes on to say that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. So these are the divine principles behind the angel's warning to the saints in Babylon. Come out that you may not participate in her sins, number one. But number two, he says that you may not receive of her plagues. That's a reference to the final judgments associated with the seventh bowl judgment that we've studied. Remember back in verse 18 of chapter 16, we read about a great earthquake that will flatten all of the cities of the nations. But we read that Babylon the Great, this capital city of the Antichrist, will become a special object of divine wrath. In verse 19, we read, and Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. And so he's saying, come out because of these two things, because of the danger of participating in her sins, and that you might avoid this wrath. It's reminiscent of God calling Lot and his family out of Sodom. Get out, because I'm going to destroy it. Well, we've seen the doom and the danger of Babylon. Thirdly, let's notice her deeds. In verse 5, we have the reasoning for this impending judgment. For her sins have piled up as high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. It's interesting, piled up. Could be translated even joined. It's from a Greek word, kalao, and it literally means to glue together. And the idea here is that the sins of Babylon have been glued together, layer upon layer upon layer, creating a final structure of wickedness that has reached all the way up into heaven. This is imagery that reaches back to the ancient Tower of Babel that first gave birth to this satanic system. In fact, Jeremiah speaks about this in Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 9, in his pronouncement of judgment upon ancient Babylon. There the Holy Spirit uses the same language. We read, forsake her and let us each go to his own country, for her judgment has reached to heaven and towers up to the very skies. Same imagery. Notice more of her deeds in verse 6. Pay her back even as she has paid, and give back to her double according to her deeds. In the cup which she has mix twice as much for her. This is a plea for retributive justice based upon the Old Testament principle of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Jesus spoke of this in Matthew 5:38. We read about it in the law, Exodus 21, for example. In Latin, this was called lex talionis, the law of retribution, a principle that can even be found in ancient Babylon and the Code of Hammurabi. As a footnote, this is a vengeance that is reserved solely for God. It's his prerogative. The Lord has said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. We are told to bless those who persecute us. We are told to love our enemies. Paul said in 1 Thessalonians 5:15, see that no one repays another with evil for evil, but always seek after that which is good for one another and for all people. Now keep in mind, the issue in all of these commands is the mortification of pride that inevitably seeks retaliation for some personal offense. That's just our nature. However, they do not preclude the use of whatever is necessary to protect yourself and your family, or the need for retaliation against criminal people that would come in and attack our country, military aggression, and so forth. In fact, war is literally an extension of capital punishment. Genesis 9:6, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. But of course, this is all the responsibility of government that God has placed over us, that bears the sword in protection of the people. So we see the Lord invoking this principle of lex talionis upon ancient Babylon even, for the staggering cruelty that they perpetrated upon God's covenant people, Israel. In Jeremiah 50, verse 29, we read, "Summon many against Babylon, all those who encamp against her on every side. Let there be no escape. Repay her according to her work, according to all that she has done, so do to her. For she has become arrogant against the Lord, against the Holy One of Israel." So, verse 6, "Pay her back, even as she is paid, and give back to her double according to her deeds." Literally, double the double things. Now keep in mind, this is not double in severity, but in measure. The idea is that of an exact equivalent. It's in the same, the concept here in the original language is the same sense as a person looking just like another person, and we might say that is a person's double. So, give back to her double according to her deeds. In the cup which she has mix twice as much for her. In other words, make sure she gets every ounce of what she deserves. And the angel continues in verse 7, "To the degree that she glorified herself and lived sensuously, to the same degree give her torment and mourning. For she says in her heart, I sit as a queen, and I am not a widow and will never see mourning." Notice the three categories of wickedness that summarizes God's indictment. First, she glorified herself. That's the sin of pride, self-glorification. Secondly, she lived sensuously. Literally in the original language, it could be translated becoming wanton. It's the sin of finding satisfaction and joy in luxury and material things rather than in God, which includes lusting for pleasure and being consumed with self-gratification, self-indulgence, those kinds of things. And it even encompasses the idea of including the ruthless exercise of force and violence that people will use to secure what they feel like they must have. She lived sensuously. Thirdly, she says in her heart, I sit as a queen and I'm not a widow and will never see mourning. This is the sin of haughty self-sufficiency, of self-centeredness, all of which is tantamount to self-deification. Is this not a perfect summary of the world described in 1 John 2 that we read earlier? The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life. It's not from the Father, it's from the world. And the world is passing away and also its lust. The phrase in verse 7, I sit as a queen and I am not a widow and I will never see mourning, really echoes the arrogant boast of ancient Babylon that is described in Isaiah chapter 47, verse 7. When she said, I will be a queen forever. And then the Lord replies in verse 8 and following, now then, hear this, you sensual one, who dwells securely, who says in your heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. I will not sit as a widow, nor no loss of children. And God says, but these two things will come on you suddenly in one day. Loss of children and widowhood, they will come on you in full measure. In spirit of your many sorceries, in spite of the great power of your spells, you felt secure in your wickedness and said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and your knowledge, they have deluded you. For you have said in your heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. But evil will come on you, which you will not know how to charm away. And disaster will fall on you for which you cannot atone, and destruction about which you do not know will come on you suddenly. And you may recall, friends, in Daniel 5, during Belshazzar's great feast, a hand appeared on the wall and wrote an inscription. God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. You have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and Persians. And that very night, Babylon fell, a picture of the judgment that will one day befall future Babylon, the great, Satan's final empire ruled by the Antichrist.